Hello, my name is Dr. Owena Christensen, and I will be speaking to you today about my research looking at whether the human appendix is a friend or foe in the expeditionary setting. On this occasion, I have nothing to disclose. There are a number of learning objectives which I hope that we will achieve by the end of this presentation. The project started off because I wanted to go to Antarctica as a doctor, but I didn't want to lose my appendix, so I thought it would be worthwhile looking into this issue and if there were long-term implications to not having an appendix, and I carried this out as a research project for a graduate certificate in space studies. So I wanted to look at the long-standing proposition that the appendix was useless, that it didn't matter if you didn't have one, that there were no relevant ethical issues and no risk of long-term harm. And the project was divided into 6 key sections, looking at the planning phase, also prevention and prophylaxis, the appendix itself and interaction with the immune systems, diagnosis, management, and risks and consequences, including surgical complications and long-term health implications. Like many things, this started on a scrap of paper and morphed into the mind map that we see here. If we start with the planning phase, of course, it's really important to plan for the risk of medical events in spaceflight, but acute appendicitis is not one of the highest ranked gastrointestinal issues in NASA's list of space medical conditions. There's been no history of appendicitis in astronauts to date, and this is not current NASA policy or ESA policy. When you're thinking about who goes, it's really important to pick the right people, and also from a medical perspective to do a personalised risk assessment, as people will have different risks based on their age, gender and genetic background. There are some ethical issues. Can you justify appendicectomy for employment purposes? What happens if something goes wrong? Who takes care of that? And a number of other issues. It's also important to consider if we can predict or prevent appendicitis and if there are any helpful prophylactic strategies. There's not actually a lot of research on prevention and prophylaxis for appendicitis, but the literature suggests that immunodeficiency and the hygiene hypothesis can be relevant. And there's another health risk in that environmental stresses, including those in remote environments, can contribute to the development of inflammatory bowel disease. The gut microbiome might turn out to be our friend in this regard. It will change in extreme environments, particularly if diet is limited, and for it to be healthy, you need both probiotics, the good bacteria, and the prebiotics, the fiber-rich foods which feed them. Another potential prophylactic is vitamin D. The appendix itself has been thought to be useless for a long time, but research going back to the 1970s increasingly shows that it's an important part of the gut immune system. It does appear to have evolved to have a purpose. It contains stem cells and infection-fighting immune cells, and it is a reservoir for good bacteria. Diagnosis is also critical to get it right. The fundamentals include a good clinical examination and history, thorough physical examination, scoring systems and algorithms. Laboratory tests might be limited in remote settings. Imaging can be very useful. Ultrasound could be available in the expedition or space setting, but CT and MRI will generally only be available in health facilities. If someone is suspected to have appendicitis, there are a number of options. Some cases actually resolve spontaneously. Of course, surgery is an option. Intravenous antibiotics is now well accepted as a first-line treatment. And percutaneous drainage and antibiotics has also been used with some success in the submarine environment. If people are having any kind of surgery, there are always risks of harm, including death or disability both from the surgery itself and from the use of anesthesia, and there's a range of potential post-surgical complications. And if you no longer have an appendix, then you don't have the immunoprotective role that it provides anymore. There isn't a lot of evidence relating to prophylactic appendicectomy, so we have to draw information from all the negative appendicectomies where the appendix, when taken out, turned out not to be pathological. There is a reasonable risk of complications. Probably about 30% of patients experience some kind of surgical, medical or infectious complication, and immune suppression in extreme environments might potentially provide an additional risk overlay. There's a very broad range of possible operative and post-operative complications. And there's actually long-term risk from fibrous adhesions, which often develop inside the abdomen after surgery. So there's an ongoing risk of a small bowel obstruction, and this risk never goes away. It was actually an issue for astronaut Chris Hadfield, who had a history of appendicectomy and adhesions, and the doctors were very worried before he went on his ISS Expedition 35, and they wanted to have a look to see if there were any adhesions. He refused, and eventually ultrasound examination showed things to be normal. There is an increased statistical risk of various long-term health outcomes, including autoimmune disease, cancer, heart disease, infection, diabetes, and more. A recent high-powered study showed an increased risk of Parkinson's disease. So there's not just one but many serious diseases with an increased risk after appendicectomy, and some of these risks can manifest quite early on. So there's implications not only for expedition medicine but also medical practice generally, and this could also be relevant for being in space, whether you're on a spacecraft or on another celestial body where facilities to treat and manage serious chronic diseases will be limited. If you don't have an appendix anymore, the best advice that you can have is to maintain a healthy and diverse gut microbiome. So if we look at the balance overall, whether the appendix is friend or foe, it does appear to have a number of benefits. It can potentially cause us difficulties, and of course this may pose special challenges in expeditionary settings such as space travel. And in conclusion, employment-related compulsory appendicectomy is a complex issue, and the risk-benefit profile is likely to be different in different circumstances. And there's also the overlay of compromised immune function in extreme environments. So perhaps being without an appendix might be more of a liability, and it might actually be protective for expeditioners to keep their appendix. These research findings have implications not only for expedition and space medicine, but also medical practice generally and for health economics. So, final conclusion, there's evidence to suggest as a general rule the appendix does us more good than harm, so perhaps it's time to challenge the paradigm that we should reach for the scalpel rather than the antibiotics. Thank you very much for your attention. Please don't hesitate to contact me if you would like any further information. And on the following set of slides, I've included some of the extra research questions which need to be addressed going forward for Section 1, Section 2, Section 3, Section 4, Section 5, and finally Section 6. And lastly, I've included the references and image credits. Thank you again for your attention.